Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, and thank you for joining APQC's Smart Human Capital Management webinar, Strategic Workforce Planning Best and Next Practices. I wanted to let everyone know that our breakout sessions are being posted very soon for our upcoming Process and Performance Management Conference happening this October 2nd through 6th, I hope everyone will register. There's some really great HR employee engagement type sessions, so make sure you stay tuned for that information. And if you want to be included on any of the emails announcing new things about the conference, be sure to email me at this email address here, and I will be sure to add you to our list. A few housekeeping items before we jump into the webinar. We are live tweeting during this webinar, so be sure to join the conversation on Twitter and use the hashtag HCMAPQC. All attendee lines are muted, so be sure you are listening to the webinar, and we will get to the Q&A at the end. The Q&A tool is located on the right of your screen, and if you have any questions, be sure to submit them there, and Alyssa will address them. The webinar will be recorded, and you will receive a copy of the slides as well as the recording in a few days. I would now like to take a couple moments to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. First, we have Alyssa Tucker, the Human Capital Management Principal Research Lead here at APQC. Building on more than 15 years of experience in human resources research, writing, and advising, Alyssa develops and executes APQC's Human Capital Management Research Agenda. She has completed numerous research studies and reports on such topics as leadership, talent optimization, human resource trends, recruiting and hiring, training and development, performance management, and talent management. Additionally, we have IBM's Susan Steele. She is a former Global Chief Human Resources Officer who advises C-suite leaders on workforce strategies that increase revenues, enhance profitability, improve process efficiencies, and create sustainable organizational change. Her background includes Chief HR Officer, Chief Learning Officer, and Chief Talent Acquisition Officer roles at WPP, Deloitte, and global law firm Linklaters. Her early career was in P&L leadership roles at investment banks JP Morgan Chase and HSBC, and with the NASDAQ PHLX Derivatives Exchange. Susan is a frequent commentator on the evolving nature of the workplace and the importance of employee experience design. Her thought leadership has been referenced by Forbes and The Economist, and she has recently spoken at Wall Street Journal, SAP, IBM, and Disrupt HR events. Born in the U.S., Susan has spent more than 50% of her life living abroad. She's worked in Europe, Africa, Middle East, Asia Pacific, France.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maddie, for that wonderful introduction. I would like to welcome all of our listeners. I'm very excited to have you here today. Susan and I are both really excited to be sharing for the first time the results of APQC's latest, oops, I went too far there. Okay, of APQC's latest strategic workforce planning research, which is sponsored by IBM. Susan will be kicking things off today, talking about the importance of this topic. Then I'll jump in to tell you about how we conducted our research and what we found. I'll be sharing a number of strategic workforce planning best practices, and we've organized these under the following 5 themes: creating the charter and the team, establishing the process, supporting the process, creating the plan, and implementing the plan. And we'll conclude the webinar today talking about the future of this important process. So with that,
everybody, it's Susan Steele. Great to be with you today. IBM has partnered in the publishing of this research because we're observing the rising importance of strategic workforce planning, both to IBM and to our clients. And regardless of where your organization may be in terms of digital reinvention maturity, I think we would all agree that the necessity of right people with the right skills in place at the right time has never been more challenging nor more important. Today, IBM, an enterprise known for both innovation and its own reinvention, is deploying cognitive computing, or better known as Watson, to improve organizations' ability to get the right people with the right skills at the right time. And it's really an exciting time to be witnessing how cognitive computing can actually help resolve some of the most challenging issues that we face in human capital management. For example, IBM's innovations such as Watson Recruitment or the IBM Cognitive Onboard Advisor, the Watson Career Coach, and Watson Talent Development are all bringing to life organizations' strategic workforce planning efforts in ways never really imaginable before. So yes, the day when your employees will be recruited, onboarded, developed, and retained, all with the help of cognitive computing solutions, is really not that far away. But this amazing future depends really on a robust approach to strategic workforce planning. And that's what we'll be focusing on in today's webinar.
Great. Thank you so much for setting the stage for us, Susan. So let's move on. I want to give our listeners a brief overview of our research methodology that will further put things in context for us. In late 2016, APQC launched this study with sponsorship from IBM to better understand how organizations develop and implement strategic workforce plans. We wanted to understand how organizations are using analytics in strategic workforce planning, and which strategic workforce planning practices are associated with positive outcomes. So as part of the project, we surveyed 101 organizations with relatively mature strategic workforce planning processes. These organizations represent 17 industries, 90% have global operations, and headquarters countries represented include the United States, United Kingdom, India, South Africa, Canada, United Arab Emirates, Australia, Malaysia, New Zealand, and Singapore. We then analyzed the top 25 survey participants based on program outcomes, and we compared their responses to the remaining survey respondents in order to find statistically significant differentiating behaviors and practices. We also conducted interviews with 5 organizations that exemplify strategic workforce planning best practices, and we wrote a case study for each organization. We analyzed the findings across these 3 types of inquiry, and we identified overall best practices for conducting strategic workforce planning today. So I want to tell you a little bit about each of the best practice organizations. California-based Kaiser Permanente is a nonprofit health plan. Kaiser Permanente's Northern California region serves 4 million customers with 23 hospitals and 70,000 employees. Houston-based Phillips 66 is a diversified energy manufacturing and logistics company with 14,000 employees globally. The MITRE Corporation operates 7 federally funded research and development centers that provide its government sponsors with systems, engineering, research and development, and IT support. Its principal locations are in McLean, Virginia, and Bedford, Massachusetts, and it has 7,600 employees. The U.S. Department of Agriculture's Farm Service Agency administers farm commodity, crop insurance, credit, environmental, conservation, and emergency assistance programs for farmers and ranchers. Operations are directed through headquarters in Washington, D.C., and 5 regions spanning all 50 states and Puerto Rico. The organization has 5,000 federal employees and 7,000 additional employees funded through federal appropriations. Then we have headquartered in Reston, Virginia, the U.S. Geological Survey. It is a bureau of the U.S. Department of Interior that acts as a fact-finding scientific research organization, providing impartial science to resource managers and planners, and it has 8,670 employees. In the webinar today, I'll be providing examples from these organizations. However, I want to share right now that there is much more detail behind these examples than I'm going to be able to have time to share. So I want to encourage our listeners to check out the in-depth case studies, which really show how each of these organizations' strategic workforce planning practices come together to create a really robust and successful approach. So with that said, let's look at the best practices that fall under our first theme, which is creating the charter and the team for strategic workforce planning. common thread among the best practice organizations that we interviewed is having a mission-critical reason for conducting strategic workforce planning. Executives at these organizations support strategic workforce planning efforts in order to protect their missions amid changing business requirements. It's really this combination of executive support and a pressing business need that sends a powerful signal to the organization that strategic workforce planning is a core business activity that is worthy of time and effort. For example, at MITRE, the CEO initiated an effort to standardize internal workforce planning practices among the organization's 7 R&D centers. Previously, each center director had used their own approach with varying levels of capability and expertise. And workforce planning at that time consisted of a spreadsheet outlining a 5-year projection of skills needed and turnover. But the CEO wanted instead for the centers to share information and expertise and create an organization-wide approach to make workforce planning more strategic. At the USDA Farm Service Agency, management initiated the move to a more strategic approach to workforce management with the intent of doing a better job of supporting the agency's mission over the long term. So traditionally, like at other federal agencies, the USDA Farm Service had focused on retirement rates and succession planning. By moving to a more strategic workforce planning model, management wanted to assess a broader array of workforce risks, looking beyond retirement rates to things such as attrition. And they wanted to inform a wider range of human capital decisions. So going beyond succession planning to look at things such as recruiting and engagement. So for the U.S. Geological Survey, a critical success factor has been the strong executive support leading the development of strategic workforce planning. Its process aligns strategic planning, human capital, and budgeting to ensure the organization has the mission-critical talent needed to meet its goals for the future. Kaiser Permanente's Northern California region sought to ensure effective workforce planning projects were in place after the Affordable Care Act was signed and a major disruption to the healthcare industry was anticipated. Workforce planning at Kaiser is also driven by their mission to provide affordable health care to members and by its need to meet its long-term strategic objectives. The workforce is a major component of Kaiser Permanente's expenses. To make sure this investment would be managed well, the HR function was tasked with overseeing a strategic workforce planning program that looks at needs 2 to 5 years into the future. The primary drivers for strategic workforce planning at Phillips 66 are aligning HR strategies and priorities with organizational performance goals and delivering on its strategy to be a high-performing organization. Strategic workforce planning is a means to reach strategic goals as well as to address retirement, attrition, succession, and diversity. Along with having compelling reasons, the best practice organizations have relatively small teams dedicated to strategic workforce planning. These teams report within HR. They're led by individuals who have strategic workforce planning expertise and experience and are composed of some individuals with analytics capabilities. For example, within its function and reporting to HR leadership, Phillips 66 has a workforce planning and analytics center of excellence made up of a workforce planning and analytics director and 2 analytics advisors. Then MITRE has a strategic workforce planning team leader who is a trained workforce economist. He has many years of strategic workforce planning experience at different organizations and has authored a book on workforce planning. The team leader reports to the chief HR officer, and his team includes an analytics intern and an IT and analytics FTE. The U.S. Geological Survey has 3 people on its strategic workforce planning team: a workforce planning program manager, a workforce data and analysis program manager, and a program analyst. This team reports within the Office of HR. The USDA Farm Service has a strategic workforce planning team that sits within HR. The team lead developed a strategic workforce planning methodology working at previous roles in other government organizations, and he actually joined the agency to apply this methodology. Reporting to him is a central group of 8 HR staff who dedicate most of their time to strategic workforce planning. They act as strategic partners to HR staff who are embedded in the different regions of the organization. And this team leader trained his team on the tools and resources needed to facilitate the strategic workforce planning model. Kaiser's workforce planning director reports to the Director of Strategic Workforce Management and Development, who in turn reports to the Senior Vice President of HR. The Workforce Planning Director leads a team that includes 2 senior workforce planning consultants who are responsible for guiding the planning process, collecting data, refining forecasts, and providing tools and templates to clarify and expedite the process. The team also includes 3 data analysts who have knowledge of HR information systems data and tools. These roles are not dedicated full-time to workforce planning, as the team also supports workforce analytics and reporting. I want to underscore the importance here of qualifications as a differentiator for organizations with superior strategic workforce planning outcomes. In our research, we found that the level of training, skills, and knowledge that strategic workforce planning participants possess is significantly higher for top performer organizations than for all other organizations that participated in our survey. So now I'd like to turn and talk about best practices that fall under our second theme, which is establishing the strategic workforce planning process. So APQC defines a mature process as being standardized, centrally managed with performance measures and methods for improvement. The organizations that participated in our survey have relatively mature strategic workforce planning processes. Roughly half have a standard centrally managed process with performance measures, and 1/4 are even more mature, having added a deliberate method of optimization or improvement to their processes. The best practice organizations that we interviewed also have relatively mature processes. Their strategic workforce planning teams centralize and standardize the process to leverage best practices across the organization, as well as to coordinate planning and implementation when different areas of the organization face similar or complementary workforce challenges. So, for example, MITRE has a centralized strategic workforce planning process within its 7 R&D centers, working within 3 operating centers. MITRE has 72 groups or units, which it calls portfolios, that conduct workforce planning. The strategic workforce planning process involves collecting data for each portfolio, aggregating the portfolio data by operating center, and then ultimately consolidating workforce data for the entire organization. In establishing this process, MITRE's strategic workforce planning team initially collected information on 80 pockets of isolated workforce planning activities in the organization, and they identified among these the most effective of these existing practices, and then they also benchmarked externally and researched effective planning models and best practices. At Phillips 66, the Strategic Workforce Planning Center of Excellence, working closely with the HR function, is responsible for the design, implementation, and governance of talent analytics and workforce planning, and it serves the entire enterprise. Centralizing workforce planning expertise enables their embedded HR business partners to focus their efforts on analyzing the workforce data and planning the workforce solutions. The USDA Farm Services Central Strategic Workforce Planning Team owns and facilitates a standardized process for setting immediate, which are 3 to 6 months, short-term, which are 12 months, and long-term, 3 to 5 year workforce goals. After consulting with its business partners, the team looks for common issues among the program areas, states, and regions, and then determines economies of scale and when it makes sense to bring together human capital service providers from different areas of the organization to collaboratively address those needs. At Kaiser Permanente, Northern California, the workforce planning process is standardized across the region with common tools and templates, and we'll talk about some of those in a bit. The U.S. Geological Survey's process is interesting. It's both centralized and decentralized, operating from the top down and the bottom up. So the U.S. Geological Survey has 3 distinct organizational levels. Decentralized planning at the science center level informs centralized planning at the regional level, which then informs planning at the enterprise level. So these centralized and standardized workforce planning processes that we've just talked about incorporate a similar set of sub-processes, including establishing or reviewing the business strategy, creating the strategic workforce plan, implementing the plan, and measuring strategic workforce planning outcomes. Now, some of the best practice organizations call out supply and demand gap analysis as a separate sub-process or set of sub-processes, as opposed to having it as part of the plan creation sub-process, which some companies have it. But really looking at all of the best practice organizations, they're all carrying out these 4 sub-processes in some way, shape, or form. So, for example, the U.S. Geological Survey strategic workforce planning process includes 5 sub-processes. First is set the strategic direction. Second is identify current supply, future demand, and discrepancies. Third is develop an action plan. Fourth is implement an action plan. And then 5th is monitor, evaluate, and review. So let's turn and let's look at a more visual example of these workforce planning sub-processes. So the USDA Farm Service Agency has 5 sub-processes, and they're across the top of these blue boxes on the slide. The first sub-process is strategic alignment. That's followed by workforce analysis. The third sub-process is risk mitigation and gap closure strategies. The 4th is workforce plan development. And then the 5th is plan implementation, which you'll see includes monitoring, evaluating, and revising as subcomponents. And I'll talk about these subcomponents in a bit. So we've looked at strategic workforce planning processes and now sub-processes. Now I want to turn and talk about how strategic workforce planning interacts with other processes within the organization. The majority of organizations in our survey have integrated their strategic workforce planning processes with many other processes. And the greatest levels of integration were found for succession planning, strategic planning, and business planning. At top performer organizations, strategic workforce planning is significantly more integrated with business planning compared to all other organizations in our survey. And at the best practice organizations, we saw that strategic workforce planning is integrated with human capital management processes, with the strategic planning processes, and in many cases also with the business and financial planning processes. So Kaiser Permanente Northern California provides an example of integrating with other human capital management processes. The strategies that it develops in its workforce plans can involve an array of HR functions, such as recruiting, compensation, and training and development. Kaiser indicates that for the process to work well, all of these HR groups need to be engaged in strategic workforce planning early and often. And then Phillips 66 provides an example of integration with other business processes. Strategic workforce planning is an integral part of its business planning process. Phillips 66 creates a 3-year strategic workforce plan to support its strategic and operational goals. And this 3-year plan is then updated during the organization's annual business and financial planning processes. So that's an overview of best practices for establishing the strategic workforce planning process. Our next theme is going to be talking about the supporting infrastructure. So in particular, our study explored how technology, analytics, as well as other tools support the process. So the organizations that participated in our survey make substantial use of technology in strategic workforce planning. They use technology to standardize, to automate, to analyze, to monitor, and to measure the process. Human resource information systems, talent management systems, and spreadsheets are the most common types of technologies used among the survey organizations. We found that top performer organizations leverage technology in strategic workforce planning to a greater extent, and they use statistical software, such as SPSS, significantly more than all other organizations. And so this brings me to our next findings, which are related to the use of analytics in strategic workforce planning. So the organizations in our survey make substantial use of analytics in strategic workforce planning. Most commonly, they're conducting descriptive analytics, and they're analyzing historical patterns and trends. Top performers have significantly better access to the data needed for strategic workforce planning than do all other organizations in our survey, and top performers leverage analytics in strategic workforce planning to a significantly greater extent. So at the best practice organizations, analytics also play a central role in workforce planning. And while the best practice organizations use analytics in a variety of ways, there was a relatively common theme regarding the important role that analytics play in, one, opening the door and establishing credibility for the strategic workforce planning process, and two, in starting discussions with the business that yield more relevant and more effective workforce plans. So Kaiser Permanente, Northern California, provides a good example of how analytics opens the door and establishes credibility for strategic workforce planning. The workforce planning director at Kaiser noted that while workforce planning has a long-term focus, typically looking 2 to 5 years out, many of its clients, the clients of the workforce planning team, have much more immediate needs, which really make it difficult for them to focus on long-term planning. So at Kaiser, the strategic workforce planning team has developed a set of tools to manage both the short and the long-term workforce issues. And the team has found that offering to address these short-term problems has helped them establish credibility, which they see as necessary to working with the business to do some of the more heavy lifting required to do more long-term workforce planning. Another door opener example comes from the U.S. Geological Survey. Its strategic workforce planning team has a standard set of data elements and queries that stakeholders can use to pull workforce data. The data mining tool allows different levels of the organization some flexibility, while it also maintains data comparability. In addition, the team provides assistance when customized data is needed, and it helps HR specialists and managers understand workforce planning data, measures, and metrics, and how to use them. So, for example, it helps them understand that there's not necessarily a good or a bad number. Turning to MITRE, MITRE provides a good example of how analytics helps establish better workforce plans. So in meetings with the business, MITRE's strategic workforce planning team talks about what the numbers really mean. So rather than focusing on numeric projections, the team asks what skills are growing. This prevents the business from getting too hung up on making like precise forecasts that they lose sight of the bigger picture in planning. Then the strategic workforce planning team will partner with the modeling and simulation team at MITRE to build scenarios based on the qualitative information yielded in these discussions. And MITRE shared that it's found that the qualitative information led to more specific directives than spreadsheet-based forecasts had. The team's director explained to us that whereas analytics establish credibility for strategic workforce planning, the data needs to be placed in context for it to be actionable. Phillips 66 and USDA Farm Service Agency, they also use analytics as a means to establish better workforce plans. The Strategic Workforce Planning Center of Excellence at Phillips 66 provides a quarterly human capital analytics dashboard for executives, business leaders, HR business partners, and the recruiting team. And this 6-page report includes key challenges, overall performance, along with a description of specific workforce trends by business segment. The talent dashboard helps HR business partners have quantitative as well as qualitative conversations with business unit leaders. So here again we see that importance of not just the quantitative, but the quantitative opening the door for having qualitative conversations and then ultimately yielding better workforce plans. And then the USDA Farm Service Agency's Strategic Workforce Planning team uses HR information system data in risk assessments. These assessments use 5-point rating scales to quantify different kinds of risks. So the risk ratings are a starting point for the team to conduct additional analyses. And analytics ultimately drive which human capital initiatives are included in the workforce plan, such as where should they develop pipelines, manage knowledge, or develop expertise. Sorry, I have a little trouble with my slides. Okay, there we go. One surprise for me was how much the best practice organizations talked about analytics and tools as opposed to specific technologies. So I want to share some information regarding how they use tools, which may or may not be delivered with the use of technologies. So for the best practice organizations, tools are a means through which to achieve process standardization and centralization, and they're also a way to engage and educate stakeholders outside of the strategic workforce planning team. So for example, at the U.S. Geological Survey, all participants have access to the same tools to ensure that every workforce plan has the mandated common elements. But the tools also have some flexibility so that users can choose or modify elements as their needs dictate. Some examples of these tools which are made available online, there's a workforce planning model, a workforce planning desk guide, there are guided inquiry questions, a workforce plan template, a data planning guide, and then there are also standardized data queries. The Strategic Workforce Planning team at the U.S. Geological Survey created these tools, and some of them were based on models that they found at other federal or state agencies. Then turning to what we have on this slide, Kaiser Permanente, Northern California, uses many tools and templates. I'm going to talk about 2 that I've put up on this slide, but there are more in the case study in addition to more description of the 2 that are on this slide. First on this slide is Kaiser's Strategic Driver Matrix, which aids in understanding how changes and innovations in the organizational environment, so changes in technology and demographics, how these will affect demand for labor. So this is used in workshops and interviews with senior and operational leaders, and this matrix helps them look at changes through two lenses. First, how will the amount and type of work need to change? And then 2, how will the capacity to do the work change? And then the next assessment on this slide is Kaiser's Risk Assessment Matrix. And again, through workshops, participants use this matrix to link workforce shortages and skills gaps to specific business risks. Once those risks are identified, then it's possible for them to identify specific workforce strategies and prioritize them and make the business case for the most critical ones. So tools, technology, and analytics provide support for strategic workforce planning. Let's talk in more detail about how organizations create their plans. One common theme that we observed is that when it comes to creating the strategic workforce plan, business units have significant involvement, often alongside strategic planning, workforce planning teams, and business unit embedded HR business partners. Top performers experience more involvement from business unit managers compared to all other organizations in our survey. In addition, top performers are significantly more likely to place primary accountability for plan creation with the business as opposed to the strategic workforce planning team or embedded HR business partners. So let's look at this and how it plays out at the best practice organizations. Look at how these organizations handle involvement and accountability for creating the strategic workforce plan. So the USDA Farm Services Strategic Workforce Planning Team owns and facilitates the process. Executive directors in each state are accountable for creating the plan with the workforce planning team. The team has educated managers and executives that workforce planning is a management responsibility and not an HR task, as long-term sustainability of the agency's capability to accomplish its mission is a management, not an HR function. At Phillips 66, the strategic workforce planning team owns the process and the support tools and coaches embedded HR business partners who are responsible for creating that workforce plan collaboratively with business unit leaders. And as noted earlier, interviewees at Phillips 66 shared that by centralizing the workforce planning expertise, this frees the HR business partners to focus more on analyzing the data and providing solutions, and to do that with the business units. So looking at Kaiser Permanente, Northern California, the workforce planning team is ultimately responsible for plan creation, but it's really a collaborative activity that involves executives, middle and upper middle management, and HR leaders. So executives provide strategic direction. Middle and upper middle management explain how work occurs on the front lines, and this is something that Kaiser talked to us about being a key element to make sure you capture in your workforce plans, not just focusing on executives, but also having the involvement of those middle and upper middle management who know how things work day to day in terms of operations. And then HR leaders are offering feedback on forecast assumptions, and they're facilitating dialogue with the different HR subject matter experts in the organization. And Kaiser's workforce planning director explained to us that, he said, we're the workforce planning experts. They're the experts in the business, in healthcare operations, and how to take care of members. We marry those two things together. They help us understand operations, and we then harvest the information we need to develop a workforce plan. So I thought it was a really nice way to explain how the different areas of expertise come from different stakeholders to create a workforce plan. So I want to turn and talk about the different types of information that all of these stakeholders are using to create their workforce plans. So each of the organizations that we surveyed and interviewed relies on many different inputs to assess talent demand. Among the surveyed organizations, the most commonly used inputs include organizational strategy, business and operational plans, competency models and skills taxonomies, as well as forecasting models and employee surveys. Our research also showed that organizations use a variety of inputs to assess talent supply. Among the survey participants, inputs commonly used include analysis of workforce utilization, skills assessments and inventories, analysis of workforce demographics, input from the business, performance ratings, and high potential development plans. The best practice organizations also use a variety of inputs to assess talent demand and supply. For example, The USDA Farm Service Agency's workforce planning model that we looked at earlier includes 22 subcomponents, such as people and position risk analyses. The workforce planning team will hold an initial consultation with the agency's executive directors, during which they'll present workforce profiles and they'll ask guided inquiry questions. They'll look at internal and external business drivers, areas of increasing and decreasing emphasis, challenges and priorities. And then based on the discussion, the team identifies which of these 22 subcomponents would be most value for creating the workforce plan. For the Northern California region of Kaiser Permanente, where an increased cost of living causes for them a spike in transfer requests, mobility is a significant input in their workforce plans. The strategic workforce planning team will evaluate internal talent supply patterns, and they'll target facilities that are having a harder time retaining employees due to regional factors. And then at Phillips 66, they share that demand is a relatively stable factor for them. Retirement and attrition are key areas of assessment as a result. And so the Workforce Planning Center of Excellence at Phillips 66 focuses on metrics that affect succession and replacement needs. And then finally, the U.S. Geological Survey looks at many different inputs. Some of these include workforce flexibility, work schedules, supervisory ratio, gender, hires and separations, resignations and involuntary separations, among many other inputs. And how these inputs grow and shrink helps inform where to target interventions at the U.S. Geological Surveys in their strategic workforce plan. And this actually brings me to our next finding. When we were designing this study, I hypothesized that organizations would only conduct workforce planning for certain pre-established, kind of set in stone segments of the workforce. And what we found was not what I had expected. Organizations, they do eventually narrow the focus of their plans, but at the start of plan creation, they keep an open mind. So essentially, they let organization strategy, business inputs, as well as workforce analytics determine which areas of the workforce to focus their plans on. One interesting note is that top performers focus significantly more on revenue-generating positions in their strategic workforce plans. Perhaps top performers are more in tune with organization strategy and business needs than other organizations. If you recall, we talked earlier that these organizations had strategic workforce planning processes that are significantly more integrated with business planning, and they have more business unit manager involvement in their plan creation. So looking at the best practice organizations, MITRE examines the entire workforce, but focuses on areas identified in interviews with directors and via scenarios and gap analysis. The USDA Farm Service Agency's workforce planning effort isn't focused on a particular occupation, but instead they focus on anticipating what skill sets will support the agency's mission. Another area of openness for the organizations represented in our study relates to gap closing strategies. So these organizations consider the full range of human capital management strategies for closing gaps. They consider build, borrow, buy, redeploy, as well as redesign strategies in their strategic workforce plans. Among the organizations in our survey, the most common gap closing strategies are 1, developing talent, and 2, hiring talent. A finding that I think is particularly interesting is that top performers use talent redeployment and work redesign as an implementation strategy significantly more than all other organizations. I think this maybe speaks to how strategic and mature their workforce planning processes are. If you think of it with more advanced planning and with plans that more closely reflect organization strategy as well as business needs, you know, these top performer organizations have the lead time as well as the information that they would need to redeploy existing workers and to redesign jobs. So I thought that was an interesting finding from this survey. The best practice organizations also use the full or consider the full spectrum of human capital implementation strategies. Looking at Phillips 66, they use total rewards, talent management, acquisition, diversity, inclusion, among other human capital strategies to close their gaps. Implementation strategies that are identified in the U.S. Geological Survey's current enterprise workforce plan include developing a multi-sector workforce, resource sharing, increasing diversity, and succession planning. And then at the USDA Farm Service, strategic workforce planning touches all components of the human capital arena, from development to recruitment to knowledge management to engagement to organizational structure, as well as succession planning. In addition, at the USDA Farm Service, a sustainability model is used to see how and where people can advance. So this model looks at transferable skills and competencies among several different occupations so that employees can be prepared to step into different positions. And as you can see, if you look at the far right of this slide, the green portion of this slide, this is showing that MITRE uses the full spectrum of human capital management solutions to close gaps, so including recruiting, training, retention, transfers. I wanted to share this example because MITRE, they provide a really good example regarding how the information that's gleaned in workforce planning can support the use of redeployment as a gap closing strategy. So in one instance, MITRE's workforce planning analysis revealed that some cyber skills, demand, and related engineering skills were in decline. So the organization was able to train and migrate existing employees into desired areas. Also at MITRE, workforce planning information is affecting succession planning and individual career planning. MITRE has a program called Careers in Motion, which aims to provide better information for employees to direct their own careers. So employees are provided with broad level information about the shifts that the workforce planning team sees and what customers, which they call sponsors, need from MITRE. And MITRE encourages and provides significant support for employees to develop these in-demand or desired skill sets. So I want to turn now and talk about implementation. Who is responsible and what happens if business conditions change? So when it comes to implementing strategic workforce plans, involvement and accountability rests even more with the business and less with the strategic workforce planning team. And compared to all other organizations, top performers are significantly more likely to give line managers primary accountability for implementing the strategic workforce plan. And perhaps these organizations understand that without line manager participation, any hiring or training initiative cannot be fully successful. So many of the best practice organizations that we interviewed talked about their strategic workforce planning teams monitoring and supporting plan implementation, but not leading or enforcing it. Instead, implementation is carried out by business leaders and managers in conjunction with their aligned HR business partners. So let's look at some examples. At Phillips 66, embedded HR business partners have primary accountability for implementing the plan. They have the relationships with their own leadership teams that can facilitate this implementation, and they're also best positioned to pull support from appropriate HR centers of excellence, such as recruiting or training. At Kaiser Permanente, the business units are primarily responsible for the successful implementation of the workforce plan. The workforce planning team collaborates in a supportive role. Then if we look at MITRE, their embedded HR business partners have primary responsibility for implementing the plan with involvement from HR areas of expertise such as recruiting, learning, succession, planning. The strategic workforce planning team is involved as a technical advisor upon request, and it also tracks results. So if business conditions change, the organizations in the study are prepared to adjust. Agility is achieved through ongoing engagement and conversations between the strategic workforce planning teams, HR, and business leaders. In fact, more than 1/3 of survey respondents discuss current and future talent needs throughout the year to a large extent, and half say this happens very much. Top performers are more actively engaged with business leaders throughout the year compared to all other organizations. Among the best practice organizations, the strategic workforce planning teams have regularly scheduled meetings with the business to assess implementation progress and to adjust implementation strategies or workforce plans as needed. So for example, MITRE considers strategic workforce planning to be an ongoing process. The workforce planning team stays engaged with the business to ensure implementation strategies are working and meeting expectations. MITRE shares that this works best when there are monthly or at least quarterly discussions between the workforce planning team and the business, and the team supports adjustments to strategies, and it will notify the business when the organizational outlook or other factors have changed. Then looking at the USDA Farm Service Agency, their strategic workforce planning team expects factors to change throughout its human capital initiatives. So stakeholders meet at least monthly to assess progress on action plans. The central group looks to modify its supporting resources as needed. So the workforce planning team looks to provide support as needed. And then at Kaiser Permanente, Northern California, strategic workforce planning is an ongoing living process. We see that theme here. The workforce planning team takes a flexible approach to monitoring. So some managers wish to touch base weekly, others less frequently. Through the course of these conversations, the workforce planning team works to support adjustments to the strategies. So that brings us to our final best practice, which relates to outcome measures. So a large majority of the survey respondents have seen significant improvements since engaging in strategic workforce planning. They've seen improvements in voluntary turnover, return on workforce investment, employee engagement, internal hiring, the leadership pipeline, and staffing costs. Top performers have seen more improvement on many of these outcome measures. Measurement is really the linchpin of any organizational program's effectiveness. And even though the preventative and the long-term nature of workforce planning makes it difficult to measure. Many of the best practice organizations mention to this. It is not an easy thing to measure, because you have the long time horizon and for the plan, and then to see results takes even longer. And then if you've prevented something, you can't necessarily measure that as easily. But the strategic workforce planning teams that we talk to still track progress, and they monitor outcomes during the planning and the implementation process. Among the best practice organizations, they've all seen improvements from strategic workforce planning. Interestingly, one of the ways they address this challenge of measuring workforce planning outcomes is they don't just look at quantitative measures, they're also looking at qualitative assessment measures as well. So a couple examples: the USDA Farm Service Agency, it tracks the status and completion of human capital initiatives that it's outlined in its plans. During the actual planning process, the HR business partners and executive directors actually identify the measures that they're going to use to track progress, so measures such as time to hire. And then upon completion, they assess, ultimately whether risks to the business have been reduced through workforce planning. And the strategic workforce planning team at Phillips 66, they compare their dashboard forecasts to actual outcomes, and they also look at numerous qualitative measures of outcomes. I wanted to share some of these that they look at. They reported to us that they see executives are having richer discussions about the workforce. HR business partners are taking an analytical approach to demographics. HR business partners understand when to build instead of buy. They understand the role of performance management and employee retention, and college recruiting approaches and critical skills training development have been refined. So that brings us to the future. What is next? What does the future hold for strategic workforce planning? In our survey, we asked respondents how the strategic workforce planning process will change in the next 5 years at their organizations. And overall, respondents anticipate substantial progress. However, top performers were significantly more likely to say their organization's future workforce planning processes will be characterized by a number of things, including greater use of real-time data, more use of talent optimization models, more investment from the business into strategic workforce planning, more stakeholders involved in strategic workforce planning, greater integration of strategic workforce planning with other processes, more accurate forecasts of talent supply and demand, greater use of technology in the strategic workforce planning process. So the future looks bright, according to our survey participants, as well as the best practice organizations that we spoke with. So today, I shared a high-level overview of the findings of this research. There were a lot of findings and much more than I was able to share with you today. So I encourage you to check out our research collection. Everyone will get a link to it when they receive the recording and slides from today's webinar. You'll find a lot more details, especially about those best practice companies and how their programs work. So now I would like to turn things over to Maddie and see if we can get a couple questions in.
Sure. Thanks, Alyssa, for that great presentation, and Susan for your insight there at the beginning. I think we have time for one question, so I'll go ahead and kick us off. And as a reminder, if anybody has any additional questions and we don't have time for them, we will be sure to follow up with you via email after the webinar. So our question we have is, how far out does the typical workforce plan extend? So how many years into the future are planned for?
Okay, sure. That is something that we asked about both on our survey as well as we asked the best practice companies about. And so we were looking at strategic workforce planning. So typically that is looking at 2 to 7 years out. I would say the most common range from our survey participants as well as our best practice organizations would be between the 2 to 5 year range. 3-year out plans that look 3 years out into the future were very common, which I think I spoke of in some of the examples today. But to truly be a strategic workforce plan, it really needs to look more than 1 year, I think, into the future.
Okay, great. And I think we can do one more question here. How do organizations assess the external environment?
Okay, so yeah, today we talked about a lot of different assessments that the organizations we studied use. I will say that especially in talking to the best practice organizations, we heard a lot more focus on the internal inputs, really in assessing what the demand for talent was from the organization and what kind of supply was going to look like from the organizational perspective. It's not that they don't look at external factors, that they do, and in our survey we did ask about that. Common and external factors include looking at, what's technology, how's technology changing, what's going on in the industry. Organizations are also looking at labor market trends. We talked to best practice organizations, and they're very much looking at education trends as inputs into their workforce plans. So those are some of the external factors that go in to creating the plans.
Okay, great. And Alyssa, we did have one last question come in that I want to make sure we get time to cover.
Great.
Where would someone find workforce planning or strategic workforce planning within APQC's process classification framework?
Sure. It would be if we're using the PCF, the 6.0 version of the PCF, it would be process 6.1, which is titled Create and Manage HR Strategy. And so it falls within there. It's pretty high level, so I think you can definitely check out the PCF, but if you're looking for more details, getting down to more of the activity levels beyond those sub-processes that we talked about, I encourage you to look at the best practice report and look at how other organizations are handling those activities. But it's 6.1, Create and Manage HR strategy.
Great, and we'll include that in the follow-up email as well in case anyone else needs a link to that location. So I'm going to go ahead and close it out here. I want to thank Alyssa for presenting and Susan again for your insight. As a reminder, everyone will receive a copy of the recording as well as the slides within a few days. And if you have any questions for Alyssa, maybe that we didn't get covered today, or you think of a question later this week, feel free to reach out to Alyssa via email, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Also, visit our expertise pages where we house new research that we just released, upcoming webinars, and more. Also, don't forget to connect with us on social. We're very active, and we post everything from survey opportunities to upcoming conferences, events, new content, and more. And we would really appreciate it if you could take a moment to let us know what you thought today on the post-webinar satisfaction survey. Thank you, everyone, for joining the webinar. We hope you have a wonderful afternoon.